This week, I point at a block of flats, I squat by a grave, and I take another trip on the Newcastle metrooooo. Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now I am in Jarrow, in Tyne and Wear, just near Newcastle, with the aim of looking at the Jarrow March, or as it's known in these parts, the Jarrow Crusade. Now it started here in Jarrow Town Hall, and what I want to look at today is look at the national picture, what was going on, look more locally at what's the main causes and issue were, some individuals, and maybe have a look at the march itself. So come along and join me. Let's first look at the national context. What was going on? Well, there's just a few things to say. First and foremost is unemployment and downturn. About 3 million men in the UK were unemployed at the time, about 23%. Why? Well, there had been a bit of a boom post-First World War, but then after that, Britain had started to decline and couldn't quite compete with America and other aspects of Europe, etc. And of course, the Wall Street crash in 1921 and the Great Depression. Lots of job losses hit industry hard. So unemployment is a big issue, and that impacts obviously the poorest in society the most, of which Jarrow is part of, which we'll talk about in a minute. Another thing that's going to lead to the march is there's actually a bit of a culture of marching. Workers' marches sort of going protesting. There had been a general strike, 1926 for example, so the idea of a march is not necessarily a new thing. And obviously connected to that is another video that I've made, the one on Cable Street. That of course was a march, but that was a march by fascists, and indeed there was rising fascism within the country. So many of those of a more socialist persuasion, which we're going to look at in the Jarrow Crusade, wanted to counteract that. Let's now look at the local context. Now Jarrow had a long history, and in the 7th century the Venerable Bede was based here and wrote all his histories of England. And the main monastery, huge monastery, which was dissolved under Henry VIII. So a long history. By the 19th century, it became a huge industrial powerhouse. None so more than here, the former site of Palmer's shipyard. A huge place where massive dreadnoughts and battleships and cruise liners were built. And they built about 1,000 ships here on the River Tyne. It was huge. But unfortunately, by 1932, Palmer's shipyard had closed. Now, we discussed unemployment being very high in Britain, about 20-odd%. In Jarrow, unemployment was over 50%. Why? Because most men were worked here in the shipyards, which had just closed down. So that is a huge catalyst. But what else? Jarrow was an incredibly poor area. This is before we had the NHS and welfare state. So the standard of living here was terrible. Infant mortality very high. 3 families to a house, that sort of thing. Now they lose their jobs as well. Even worse yet, so that happened in 1932, the closure of the shipyards, but then there had been, people of Jarrow had been made lots of false promises, new steel works, things like that, new factories coming in. They never actually materialised. They are getting more and more fed up. Jarrow also had a long history of coal mining, and there were mines here, but also in the Durham Coal Valley. They would come up here to the river to be sailed out, and the whole town was blanketed in black soot. So there was issues with pollution, issues with health, also because of that. These blocks of flats behind me are called Ellen Court and Wilkinson Court, and they are named, of course, after the MP for Jarrow at the time, Ellen Wilkinson. Now, she is a fantastic figure. You know, she was described as a real firebrand, and she definitely was. She had an interesting history. She had actually been one of the founding members of the British Communist Party and was fully in favour of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and was keen to have that here in Britain too. By 1935, the year she became MP for Jarrow, she maybe had mellowed a little bit, but certainly not in terms of her energy. She was keen to represent the people of Jarrow and the working class people of Britain. And indeed, it was her idea to launch a march. She was the one who made speeches about it. She pushed it in Parliament. She talked to the press about it. She was the real instigator of this all. She also went on the march for a little bit as well. She wasn't there for all of it. She had to do various different things, and she spoke eloquently about it all in the House of Parliament. She's incredible. Not only is she one of the most a very significant MP, she was one of the first female MPs as well. before setting off on the march, the men came here to the church, main church at Jarrow, to receive a formal blessing from the Bishop of Jarrow. And that's interesting because it was seen as he was quite a high ranking figure. It was seen as a justification of that, but also there is a religious element going on with all this. And that's why in these parts they call it a crusade. Connected to that though is that actually the Bishop of Jarrow may have given his blessing, but the Bishop of Durham, essentially his boss, was very critical of this, and indeed so also was the Labour Party. Ellen Wilkinson went then, after she started off the march here and did a few days, then she had to go off to the Labour Party conference in Edinburgh, and the Labour Party at the time were very critical of this. They said, you're putting these working men, you know, they're tired men, you're making them even more tired having to walk down to London for a wasted effort. So the Labour Party did not support it. After 27 days, the marchers arrived here at Marble Arch in London, their final destination. They'd had a few rest days, and the longest day was Northampton to Bedford, I think 21 miles, and the shortest day was actually the last day, Edgware on the edge of London, here to Marble Arch. And apparently their route in from Edgware was lined with people cheering them on and great fanfare, and they were playing music, etc. It was driving rain. It was Halloween, the 31st of October, unsurprising. But I think part of the reason for that is, for the crowds, is that the press had got hold of it. It was becoming a bit of a sensation, their story as they were going along. And of course, Ellen Wilkinson was being a real firebrand in Parliament, and indeed the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had been asked questions about it. They had a little sort of few speeches here at the end of that day. They went off to the east end of London, agreeing that next day they'll come to Hyde Park for another big meeting. So the next day, Sunday the 1st of November 1936, the marchers came here to Hyde Park, where there was already going to be a big rally for the Communist Party of Britain. Now this is interesting because the Communist Party had kept out of the Jarrow Crusade for a long time, for most of the trip, and indeed the organisers wanted to shun that. They said this is not a political rally, this is a social rally, and indeed they had this religious element I've spoken about. But it couldn't be avoided here because there was a huge rally. Now, the Metropolitan Police said about 3,000 people were here at that time, at that rally. The journalists and the newspapers said that about 50,000 were here. We don't know the number really, but perhaps in between those two. And there were lots of speeches, including by our friend Ellen Wilkinson, who made a speech, said, the town of Jarrow has been murdered by the steel companies, been murdered by the shipping companies. What will this government do? And then there was great fanfare, and the marchers, the people, the crusaders were paraded out, and all very good. And then over the next few days there was an expectation that things would change and that the government would get things done, and indeed a petition signed by 11,000 people was presented by the Jarrow Crusaders to the House of Commons by Ellen Wilkinson. But sadly, nothing really happened. I am in Pen Wood in Buckinghamshire at the Church of Holy Trinity, and this rather austere slab of concrete here is the grave of one of the key figures in the Jarrow March, the MP Ellen Wilkinson, that brave MP who voiced the concerns in Parliament and marched with the workers from Jarrow. She is laid to rest here. She had an amazing career after Jarrow March. She joined the government. She joined Clement Attlee's post-war government, and she was Minister of Education. Some of those amazing reforms that were brought in, national curriculum, etc., big part of it came from her. She also played a significant role in creating UNESCO, my favourite World Heritage Site. Ellen played a key role in the UN there. But sadly her death is rather tragic, really. She died aged 55 whilst Minister of Education. She died because she was suffering from chronic bronchitis and asthma, and she actually died of an overdose of barbiturates that had been given to her by a doctor. Now some people say, well, maybe she was prescribed wrongly and it was too much. There is some suggestion that she took her own life. We unfortunately will never know, but such a tragic end to such an incredible figure. Well, slightly randomly here by the Morrisons in a big car park is a rather nice statue to the Crusaders, and this is perhaps a good place to talk about legacy and how it ended. So what did the Jarrow March or Jarrow Crusade achieve? Well, actually, not much, I'm afraid. Indeed, many of the organisers, one of them described it as a waste of time, which is a bit harsh. But why? Well, I mean, they were slightly blindsided by the government, actually, when they arrived in London. So they came with this petition, and Stanley Baldwin's government basically rebuffed them and said, oh, actually, no, we've got a plan for Jarrow. We're going to have a shipbreaking yard there. And indeed, 2 ships did go to what was Palmer's shipyard, and it did create some jobs. So they did look a bit iffy there, where they turned up saying, we need some jobs, and the government says, well, here you go, here are some there. The other thing as well is that Jarrow did eventually actually get more employment, and things started to look up for Jarrow, specifically though because of the Second World War. Obviously, the Second World War the factories needed to build things, munitions, etc. Jarrow suddenly came into its own. So employment increased in Jarrow. So the need, this hunger march, maybe became less significant. So it actually went into a bit of obscurity after the first 10 years or so. But what's interesting is that it became what is known as a talisman. People associated themselves with the Jarrow Crusade as this sort of marching forward for the rights of working class people. And indeed, very interestingly, the Labour Party, which initially rejected the Jarrow Crusade and was very critical of course, have taken it on as a symbol. And through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even into Tony Blair's period, and indeed, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was a huge, huge fan, they associated themselves an awful lot with the Jarrow Crusade and its symbolism for the working class. Interesting that at the time they did not support it much. Interesting. Anyway, well, I hope you've enjoyed that. I've had a wonderful time doing that. And as always, please subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.